Audio lecture of World History Unit 7, Age of Revolutions, the Impact of the Enlightenment. We will start with the American Revolution. The American Revolution was the first revolution that was triggered by the Enlightenment. This era demands liberty and equality for all. And as we know, this is connected directly to the ideals of the Enlightenment, especially when it enshrines the ideals of natural rights of man, life, liberty, and property. The British colonists living in North America had full rights of British subjects because they were British subjects. They prized themselves on self-government, and they were not expected to pay much in taxes initially. But things will change after the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War in North America. The fact was this: 2/3 of Americans owned land and 1/5 of Englishmen owned land. So in reality, those British citizens living in the colonies in North America, that they started calling themselves Americans, even though they were still British citizens at the time, really owned more land than the traditional Englishmen did. Another fact was that 10% of Americans lived in poverty, where 50% of Englishmen lived in poverty. So the folks living in the colonies actually were a little better off than those living in Great Britain. And so when the British king passed new taxes that would just be charged to the colonists living in North America, the rest of the British citizens saw that as fair. They had more to pay, they owned more land, so why shouldn't they pay special taxes when the armies of Great Britain were sent over there to protect them? But this did not sit well with the colonists, and this will eventually lead to rebellion. Of course, the influence of the Enlightenment ideals also needs to be understood. In no part of the world are les petites and les grands so much upon a par as here, where none of the people are destitute or needy of the conveniences of life and the spirit of independence. This is Samuel Peters, who was a British loyalist, who spoke of what it was like living in the colonies. I mentioned to you that it was the 7 Years' War that actually makes this change. In 1763, after the 7 Years' War, the British, because they won the 7 Years' War, and the part of the 7 Years' War that was fought in the North American continent was also known as the French and Indian War. The British had won this war and acquired most of the French possessions in North America as a result of this victory. But even though the British won this war, it was a very costly victory, and the cost of the war caused a lot of debts for the nation as a whole, the nation of Great Britain as a whole. It was expensive to send your army across the sea to fight a war against another army, the French army that was united with the Native Americans. And so therefore, the British government, including the king, King George III, believed that the British citizens living in the New World should pay the majority of the costs of the war, since that war was there to help defend them against French taking territories and to win more territories for the British colonists to spread into. The British debt in 1756 was 75 million pounds, but after the war, the British debt was 133 million pounds. And so the British government felt that the British citizens living in North America should pay the bulk of the cost of that war, since the majority of that war was fought on that soil. The British decision to tax American colonists heavier than the rest of the British citizens ultimately was what caused the problem. It led to demands for participation in the decision-making process. The colonists living in North America were British citizens, and like all the other British citizens, had to pay the British taxes that were imposed on all British citizens. But now there were special taxes that were being passed that were only being charged to the British citizens living in North America, not to all British citizens. And ultimately, since the British colonists, citizens living in North America, did not have any vote for the Parliament, the House of Commons in Parliament, they had no voting rights for those members of Parliament, they saw themselves as being taxed extra and not having any representation in Parliament, which passed these taxes. And so the cries were no taxation without representation. In 1775, Britain's restrictive policies and taxes got worse, and ultimately it will be these that lead to the American Revolution. The British colonists living in the Americas will finally have enough, and they will try to break free and claim their independence. A quote from an English traveler in America in 1760, Andrew Burnaby, wrote, "The public or political character of the Americans corresponds with the private one. They are haughty and jealous of their liberties, impatient of restraint, and can scarcely bear the thought of being controlled by any superior power." The fact is, the British colonists got used to ruling themselves prior to the 7 Years' War. They were allowed to do so. And after, with these extra taxes and these extra acts that were passed against them, they saw that as too much oversight by the British government back at home in Great Britain. And so they wanted their independence. The average British tax in 1765 was 26 shillings, and the average American tax in 1765 was 1 shilling. So in actuality, the Americans were not being taxed nearly as heavily as the average British tax, the average British citizen, but they felt because they had special taxes that were passed just for the American colonists. They felt that that was unfair since they had no say in the Parliament that enacted these extra taxes. Now, we were introduced to Thomas Paine in the last unit. Thomas Paine wrote a long essay called Common Sense that influenced colonists to seek a break from Britain rather than reconciliation. He believed, as many like him did, that the only way that the colonists living in North America would ever be able to rule themselves as they were accustomed to prior to the 7 Years' War would be to break free from the British government and claim their own independence, establishing for themselves a new nation. Thomas Paine's Common Sense was written in very simple terms, so the regular working class individual could understand it. It was done to persuade them to support the revolution, and it worked. He said, "We have every opportunity and every encouragement before us to form the noblest, purest constitution on the face of the earth. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. A situation similar to the present hath not happened since the days of Noah until now. The birthday of a new world is at hand, and a race of men, perhaps as numerous as all Europe contains, are to receive their portion of freedom from the event of a few months." Ultimately, it will be in 1776 when the Continental Congress basically puts Thomas Jefferson in charge of writing a Declaration of Independence that used Enlightenment ideas, Locke in particular, to justify their breaking ties with Great Britain. The document says this: when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government. We therefore solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. Those portions in red are virtually direct quotes, word for word, from John Locke's two treatises on government. So the war begins, and in 1777, after the Battle of Saratoga, the Americans start to receive assistance from the French. This will be a real turning point in the war. Prior to this Battle of Saratoga, when the French decided to support the American cause, the American colonists were not doing very well. There were militia groups that raised up to fight against the British, but the British Army was one of the best in the world, and the American colonists really only had volunteers, and they were greatly outnumbered by the British forces. The French, however, having lost the 7 Years' War, and of course, having lost the portion of the 7 Years' War that took place on North American continent, which was known as the French and Indian War, they wanted payback. They wanted, first of all, to find a way to maybe reclaim some of the lands that they had lost in North America, but they also wanted to hurt Great Britain, who had defeated them in that war. If they supported the American cause for freedom, they hoped that the Americans would reciprocate by allowing them to have some, not all, but some of those lands that they lost to Great Britain in North America back. So it's interesting that France, even though they are under the rulership of an absolute monarch at this point in time, the French tax dollars and the French armies are sent over to help the Americans fight against a king and win their own freedom based on Enlightenment principles. Needless to say, you can probably figure out that it will not be too long after the American Revolution that the French people living at home in France under an absolute monarchy, having gone through the Enlightenment and been indoctrinated by the ideals of the Enlightenment, start to say, hey, we helped them win their freedom against a man who was acting like an absolute monarch, yet we are still living under an absolute monarch ourselves. That can't fly. And so eventually we will have a French Revolution as well. By 1781, the British forces surrendered to General George Washington at the Battle of Yorktown. This was largely a success because of the French money that funded the American Revolution after 1777. The French not only sent money, but they also sent help with their French fleet to blockade the shoreline, to keep the British soldiers from being able to be resupplied by the British fleet. And they also sent some important men to help train and help fight with the American colonists, people like General Lafayette, Marquis de Lafayette. Ultimately, the war will not end until 1783, but this Battle of Yorktown battle was so important that it was the beginning of the end for the British in this war. The war ends in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, which ultimately declares that America will be a free nation. Now, just so everybody knows, we will have several treaties of Paris throughout the rest of this semester. This is just the first one, so it's important. Actually, this is the second one. The first one actually was in 1763 with the end of the 7 Years' War, the end of the French and Indian War. So that's why it's important to know the years. For our purposes here, this Treaty of Paris is the most important one for this unit. It's the one that ends the American Revolution, where Great Britain has to give up their control of the colonies in North America, and the United States of America is born. The U.S., United States, became ultimately a democratic republic, stressing popular sovereignty, which means the rule of the people by the people, with written guarantees of freedom also in a written document that will eventually be the U.S. Constitution, based on Enlightenment principles. In 1787, the U.S. Constitution was created reflecting those Enlightenment ideals. We see, of course, John Locke's ideas of the natural rights of man being the heart of the government. And we also see a great deal of Montesquieu's separation of powers and checks and balances, creating a government based on 3 branches of government: an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. We also see a Bill of Rights being outlined in the U.S. Constitution. The Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and each of these rights outlines a particular individual right. Despite the political changes of the American Revolution, it led to very few social changes for the majority of people living in what is now the United States of America. Slavery still remained, and also only male landowners were allowed to vote. But it was a step in the right direction, and over time, more and more freedoms will be guaranteed in the United States of America. More and more people will be brought into the political process through voting. And of course, eventually, slavery will be outlawed after a violent civil war. The American Revolution will, however, also strongly influence Europe, especially France. As I said before, France had supported the American Revolution, not so much because they supported, because the king was an absolute monarch. He didn't support the ideas of the American revolutionaries, but a lot of people in France will, and will want the same kinds of rights secured for themselves that they helped pay for the Americans to get in their fight against the British, the natural enemy of the French. So now we will talk more about the French Revolution and how the Enlightenment is enshrined in the French Revolution. The French Revolution will be a lot more complicated than the American Revolution, and it will go through a series of phases as well. First and foremost, we need to understand what French society was like prior to the Revolution. The peasants of France suffered greatly, and the peasant suffering in France represents a major cause of the French Revolution. But the peasants themselves were not the ones that galvanized or pushed the revolution to begin. That will be the middle class. Peasants, however, lost half of their incomes, in some cases up to 80% of their incomes, in taxes that were paid each and every year. So between 50 and 80% of every amount of profit that a peasant could make farming, they had to pay feudal dues to nobles. They had to pay a tithe to the French Catholic Church. They had to pay royal taxes to the king. And they had to pay a head tax, a land tax called the taille, that every single person was supposed to pay. But the nobles ultimately passed their taxes on to the peasants living on their lands and renting lands from them. The French nobles were exempted from paying taxes, and they successfully resisted all attempts to reform the tax system. Now, I know that when we discussed Louis XIV, we talked about how he was able to effectively bring the nobles under control by forcing them to live there with him at Versailles, the Versailles Palace, and ultimately bringing some of those middle-class folks into his government, acting as his bureaucrats, instead of allowing the nobles to maintain those kinds of positions. Since the death of Louis XIV, however, we've had a couple of more Louis, okay, Louis XV and then Louis XVI. And the French nobles had been able to finagle their way back into dominance in French society. They had privileges, they weaseled out of paying their taxes, and they were kind of controlling a lot of things that the king, Louis XVI, wanted to do. They were partnered with him, but they also were able to exert their authority a lot more than they were under the previous, of course, Louis XIV. So it's important to know that things had changed a bit, and the nobles were back to their privileges like they had had during the medieval period in France. By the 1780s, France was not only suffering under the debts that they had accrued from fighting in the 7 Years' War and losing it, and the debts that they had now accrued by supporting the American Revolution. They now also were suffering a series of bad harvests had happened, and this resulted in grain shortages. These grain shortages led to sharp increases in the price of bread, which was the primary staple of all French diet, okay? And so this would be a major cause of discontent as well, and produced a kind of crisis in the economy by 1789. Arthur Young wrote in 1788, "Everything conspires to render the represent period in France critical. The lack of bread is terrible. Accounts arrive every moment from the provinces of riots and disturbances, and calling in the military to preserve the peace of the markets." The absolutist government that was created by Louis XIV did continue under Louis XV and Louis XVI, but it failed to solve France's financial problems. A lot of those financial problems actually did stem back to Louis XIV and the wars that he had fought during his reign. You'll recall from our previous unit, we talked about how the financial strain of those wars will actually not be suffered by Louis XIV himself, but by his successors. Then you add to that a series of other military defeats against Great Britain in the 7 Years' War and in the French and Indian War, losses of territory as well, and then the expense of helping to fund the American Revolution that Louis XVI decided to do in order to try to hurt Great Britain that they had just lost to, in hopes of also maybe regaining some of those lands back in exchange for helping the American cause. Ultimately, however, the grain shortage, and the cost of these wars and the war debts all caused problems. And France was on the verge of financial disaster, on bankruptcy, by the time we get to the spring of 1789. Louis XV and Louis XVI, the Sun Kings, Louis XIV's successors, were incompetent and content merely to imitate their great predecessors' outward show of power. The pomp and the magnificence remained. Finance ministers soon became expert swindlers, cheating and extorting on a grand scale. The peasants worked till they dropped, and citizens were forced to pay huge taxes to fund these kings and their nobles. The cost of the 7 Years' War, as I said, as well as the French support of the American Revolution, led to massive debt. It consumed half of the nation's annual tax revenues. And really, this all began with the wars of Louis XIV that we discussed in a previous unit. It just got worse after the 7 Years' War and the American Revolutions later. Louis XVI, who reigned from 1774 to 1792, and his Austrian-born wife, Marie Antoinette, were particularly unpopular and frivolous. They were seen as being very disconnected to the plight of the poor that were dying and starving in their own country. In 1789, Louis XVI was forced to call upon the Estates General to try to do something to fix the fiscal crisis, the economic crisis that was happening in France. He called upon this assembly of the Estates General, which was a meeting of France's three classes, basically. Now, the Estates General was not a legislature. It was just an advisory body to the king, and no absolute monarch had called upon the Estates General since Louis XIV had created an absolute monarchy. To call upon an advisory body would be admitting that you did not have real absolute power. So when Louis XVI was forced to ask the Estates General for advice on how to resolve the financial crisis, it was a humiliating thing for him to have to do. Now, the three estates in French society basically are the three class levels in French society. Okay, so it's important to understand who all belong to which estate. The first estate was actually the members of the clergy, okay? And they owned about 20% of the land in France, the monasteries and the churches, etc., as well as the manors that were connected to them. And they paid absolutely no taxes. That was the first estate. The French clergy gave a 2% gift to the monarchy every year. That was it. No real taxes. The second estate was the nobility. They made up about 2 to 4% of the population and owned 25% of the land, paying no taxes. And then the third estate equaled 95 to 98% of the French population. This was everyone else that was not a member of the clergy or of the nobility. So it was a very diverse group. It was everybody from the lowest group of peasants to the urban workers, the ones working in the cities, in the blacksmith shops and those kinds of things, all the way up to the middle class bourgeoisie, who were the business owners. The third estate is the one that paid all the taxes. At the Estates General, the first and second estates assumed each estate would receive one vote on any given measure that they might decide to advise to the king to resolve this conflict, this fiscal crisis, thus imposing their will on the third estate. The reason why they thought this is because that is always the way things had been done before, prior to the creation of an absolute monarchy, when the Estates General would be called by earlier kings. Each estate had one vote, and so the first and second estate, always voting together in support of their own privileges, would always outvote the third estate, even though the third estate represented 95 to 98% of the population. The suggested voting patterns that the third estate wanted instead was that the first estate should have 300 votes, the second estate should have 300, and the third estate, since they represented more people, should have 648. Led by Abbé Sieyès, the third estate rejected this voting method of one per estate and left the Estates General in protest. When they tried to return to the meeting hall, they were locked out by the king and the first and second estates. Abbé Sieyès argued in a document called What is the Third Estate? He said this: what is the third estate? Everything. What has it been in the political order up to now? Nothing. What is it asking for? To become something. 1789 was the beginning of the French Revolution, and it starts here at this crisis in the meeting of the Estates General. The third estate, when they were locked out of the meeting halls after storming out initially a couple of days before, they decided to meet at a place where they could gather together right there at Versailles. An indoor tennis court was the only place that could house them all. And at this tennis court, they took an oath to create a new government for France with a limited or constitutional monarchy, and with themselves being a new National Assembly for France. In other words, they wanted to create a constitutional monarchy with themselves being the new legislature for France. This is the beginning, the first action of the French Revolution. The third estate declaring themselves the National Assembly at the tennis court oath in the summer of 1789. Let us swear to God and to our country never to separate and to meet wherever circumstances might require until we have established a sound and just constitution. Jean-Joseph Mounier. Ultimately, this oath was declaring that France would no longer be an absolute monarchy, but instead a constitutional one. The third estate would accept nothing else. Now the question is what? How would the king react, and how would the first and second estates react? So, as I've said, this tennis court oath marks the beginning of the French Revolution in the late spring, early summer of 1789. After the Third Estate formed the National Assembly, as they will now call themselves, they leave the tennis court of Versailles and they go back to Paris to begin the work of writing a constitution for France. Now, Louis XVI was not fond of the idea of becoming a constitutional monarch with limited powers, as opposed to his traditional idea of being a divine right absolute monarch. So even though he allowed for the Third Estate to make their declaration and to leave Versailles and go back to Paris to start meeting and discussing the writing of a constitution, he was never really, I guess you would say, genuine in his seeming acquiescence to the people. So instead, he ordered troops to surround the city of Paris, where the National Assembly, as they're now called, are now meeting. And angry mobs saw this as the king trying to send troops to basically invade the capital city and to make war against its own people. So these angry mobs began to protest this, as well as they were protesting the rising prices of bread, which were continually a problem. As we know, the economic issues that brought about the revolution in the first place had not been resolved just because the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly. So Louis XVI ordering the troops to surround Paris really is the first of the, I guess you would say, violent actions, or the actions using force, of the French Revolution. And the people protest and they rebel against this. How the people rebel against Louis XVI's actions are in this way. On July 14, 1789, a mob of people living in Paris stormed the Bastille. Now, the Bastille was a royal fortress, a prison for political prisoners. However, there weren't very many political prisoners there anymore. What the Bastille really was a place where supplies were kept, like gunpowder and weapons. It was an armory of sorts. And the mob, what they were really after were these weapons. Yes, they freed the few political prisoners that were there, but what they really did was seize the supplies of gunpowder and weapons to now use against the oncoming royal army that is approaching Paris from Versailles, sent there, of course, by Louis XVI. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, and subsequently setting it on fire and demolishing most of it, is seen as the people's response to Louis's actions, declaring war on the people, if you will. And this was a symbol, if you will, of the fall of the old regime. The people will no longer accept the absolute rule of Louis XVI. And if he does not truly acquiesce to their demands for a constitutional monarchy, there will be more violence. The fall of the Bastille is an important symbolic act against royal power. Paris now becomes the epicenter of the revolution. And the working class people who live in Paris, the mobs who stormed the Bastille, they are now seen as a vehicle for the Third Estate to use to launch this revolution. Whoever controls the mobs of Paris can ultimately control the revolution. And this will become more and more important as the revolution becomes more radicalized in the next couple of years. At this point in the revolution, though, the Third Estate, now known as the National Assembly, is just trying to create a new constitution. They do not want to eliminate the monarchy, but they do want to limit the power of the king by creating a constitutional monarchy. That's why, even though there was some violence in this first phase of the French Revolution, we refer to it as the moderate phase, because they were only making moderate political changes, trying to create a constitutional monarchy. They are not yet talking about getting rid of the king or even killing the king, which they will in the next phase, the more radical phase of the revolution. By August of 1789, the National Assembly had created a kind of preamble, if you will, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This is a preamble to the Constitution that they will be writing for their new constitutional monarchy. And the king at this point, after the storming of the Bastille, had to acquiesce to these demands, even though he still wasn't happy about it. Ultimately, in this document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, they will outline the basis for their new constitutional government. And it will make a lot of claims that are based on Enlightenment principles. It will make the claims that all men remain free and equal in rights. And it will declare that all men have the right to liberty, equality, and fraternity or brotherhood. And those will be kind of the battle cry phrases for the French Revolution. Equality before the law is the big thing that you need to understand out of this. This is something based on Enlightenment principles, basically saying that no matter what class you were from. Your rights before the laws in France were the same, no matter if you were a peasant, if you were a working class person in the cities, if you were a bourgeoisie, middle class business owner, or if you were a noble or a clergyman. Equality before the law was enshrined in this document, and that will be the base of the new government that they will create with the Constitution that they are writing. Feudalism is officially abolished, meaning all remnants of feudalism that might have remained in society up to that point. And the National Assembly president said, "This has been a night of destruction and for public happiness. We may view this moment as the dawn of a new revolution, when all the burdens weighing on the people were abolished and France was truly reborn." The Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen has some key points that you should understand, and should understand how they're connected back to the Enlightenment. First of all, men are born and remain free and equal in rights. 2, the aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. 3, no body nor individual may exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from the nation. 4, liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. The natural rights of each man has no limits except those which assure to the other members of the society the enjoyment of the same rights. So you can do whatever you like as long as it does not harm anyone else. 5, nothing may be prevented which is not forbidden by law. 6, law is the expression of the general will. There's Rousseau right there. Every citizen has a right to participate personally or through his representative in its foundation. It must be the same for all. 7, no person shall be accused, arrested, or imprisoned except in the cases and according to the forms prescribed by law. 8, the law shall provide for such punishments only as are strictly and obviously necessary. 9, all persons are held innocent until they shall have been declared guilty in a court of law. 10, no one shall be disquieted on account of his opinions, freedom of speech. 11, every citizen may, accordingly, speak, write, and print with freedom, but shall be responsible for such abuses of this freedom. 12, the security of the rights of man and of the citizen requires public military forces. And 13, a common contribution is essential for the maintenance of the public forces. All must have some participation at some point in the maintenance of public forces, meaning the armies. 14, all the citizens have a right to decide the mode of assessment and of collection and the duration of the taxes. 15, society has the right to require of every public agent an account of his administration. 16, a society in which the observance of the law is not assured, nor the separation of powers defined, has no constitution at all. That is Montesquieu. And 17, since property is an inviolable and sacred right, no one shall be deprived thereof. Natural rights of man. Now, after that, they are still having to work on creating that Constitution. That's just kind of like the outline for what they want to include in their Constitution. So the work continues, and by the fall of 1789, there's yet another bad harvest, showing that the economic issues that really precipitated the revolution in the first place, several months earlier, had not really been resolved. In October of 1789, thousands of women marched from Paris to Versailles, demanding cheaper bread prices and insisting that the royal family move back to Paris with them rather than remaining at Versailles, where they could live in the lap of luxury out of sight from the misery that the people were going through. This is oftentimes referred to as the Women's Bread March, and it's important because it shows the role that women play in this revolution, and they were able to actually get some action. Now, of course, they were not alone. Many of the armed forces that were now being raised by the National Assembly to, not royal forces, but National Guard, supported this movement. The march to Versailles from Paris shows that these women, they were the ones that were really seeing their babies starve on a daily basis. And the mama bears were not happy. There were also rumors that had been published in newspapers throughout Paris that there were grain supplies being kept at Versailles, and the king and queen, spoiled that they were, decided that they were not going to release these stores of grain to lower the price of bread, to cause the lowering of the price of bread, to help feed their starving population. The women of Paris, as well as all of their supporters that end up marching on Versailles, would no longer accept this. And so not only did they demand the grain stores be released to them, they also demanded, as I said here, that the royal family no longer be allowed to live at Versailles, but instead have to come back to Paris, live in the old royal palace that was located in Paris before the building of Versailles, under the watchful eye of the National Assembly and the people of the capital city of Paris. In other words, the king and queen will be virtually under house arrest from that point forward. So they can't plot against the people in the revolution. Also, of course, their son will have to move back with them. Their son, who was the heir to the throne, next in line for the throne. Here's another picture of the Women's Bread March bringing the king and the queen and the Dauphin, as he's called, the heir to the throne, back with them. There were some people that were killed in the process of this Women's Bread March. Some of the bodyguards of the king and etc. will end up being killed, and their heads will be, put on pikes to lead the procession back to Paris. The Tuileries Palace was where the king and queen will now reside within Paris. The king, of course, has to surrender and agree to share power with the Legislative Assembly as well once he comes to the Tuileries Palace. So the king is actively having to say that he accepts that he will only be a constitutional monarch from this point forward. He will no longer have absolute power. And since he is now required to live there in Paris under their watchful eye, it'll be more difficult for him to try to plot against the revolution, so they think. It's important that you all remember, however, that the brother-in-law of the king, the brother of the queen, Marie Antoinette, was the emperor of Austria, Joseph II, and soon when he dies in 1790, her other brother, Leopold I. So the king actually had been hoping that he could get support from his brother-in-laws to help restore him to absolute authority at some point when things got hectic during this early phase of the revolution. Keep that in mind because that's going to be an issue as we move forward. By June of 1791, the royal family actually does attempt to escape France. Word had been received by the brother-in-law to the king. At this point, it is Leopold I. Joseph II has died in 1790, and his brother Leopold I has been put in power in Austria, the other brother to Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France. And they attempt to escape France in order to get to Austrian territories and then assemble an army. There had been a lot of people who had left France that were members of the nobility, as well, of course, the army of the Austrian Empire, to march back into France at a later date and reassert Louis XVI's absolute power. This attempt to escape France It's an attempt because he's not successful, but it shows the people of France that he is not sincere in letting his power be limited by a constitution. And therefore, a decision is going to have to be made whether or not they can keep this king on the throne, or whether they're going to have to force the revolution in another direction, a more radical direction, and instead create a republic, which is without a king. June of 1791 is when this happens, and it's known as the Flight to Varennes. Here's a picture of the king and queen and their children as they were discovered in the city of Varennes. They tried to disguise themselves as they were leaving Paris and trying to get out of French territory, but they were eventually discovered in the village of Varennes, which was near the border between France and some Austrian territories in the German principalities. They were discovered, and they will be forced to return to Paris and truly be under arrest at that point. Here is the royal carriage as it's being escorted back by the Revolutionary Guard, as they're now called, the new army for France made up of citizen soldiers. So now in August of 1791, a decision needs to be made by the French as well as other nations around Europe. The decision needs to be made in France whether or not they will continue to have a king, or they will instead decide that they will create a republic. That will be the decision that will be made, and this is the action that ultimately forces the revolution into the second phase, known as the radical phase. By late 1791, early 1792, France has entered the second phase, the radical phase of the revolution, the Republican phase. Also, we see other nations start to take action against France in this same time period. Austria, remember, brother-in-law to the king, brother to the queen, okay, Austria and even Prussia, the king of Prussia, they both demand the restoration of the king in France. They are both concerned that if the French can revolt and replace their king or remove their king from power, placing him under arrest, he will eventually be executed, but we're not there yet. Perhaps that means that this idea could spread to other nations in other parts of Europe, and they are very concerned about this. So Austria and Prussia basically declare war on the French Revolution. They declare war on the French people, and they invade France, hoping to prevent revolution from spreading and trying to force the French people to put their king back on the throne, who is now in prison. Restoring the French monarchy is in the common interest to all sovereigns in Europe, they declare, because if these ideas spread outside of France to other parts of Europe, it could be the unraveling of absolute monarchy throughout Europe. Ultimately, this will lead to warfare. Despite the Prussian threats to destroy Paris if the royal family was harmed and not put back on the throne, let out of prison and put back on the throne. This is known as the Brunswick Manifesto. Foreign forces will be defeated by the new French army, which now enshrines a lot of the Enlightenment ideals. The new French army is based on promotion by merit, and they actually are able to defend themselves fairly well against these Prussian threats and Austrian threats, at least initially. By September of 1792, as war has been declared on France, France is now at war with a, quote, European coalition, at this point made up of Austria and Prussia against the new Republic of France. September of 1792, radicals in the city of Paris, particularly, called the Sans-Culottes, That is just a nickname for them. It means without knee breeches, okay? They're working class men, the working class poor of Paris. They actually ended up taking over Paris itself, forming their own city government, executing thousands of clergy, priests, other nobles, and others who were seen to be in support of a return of France to monarchy. They would no longer accept having a king on the throne, even a constitutional one. They are the ones that are in support of creating a republic for France under the National Assembly, which was an elected body by the people of France. The September massacres, as they are called, marked the beginning of this real second phase of the French Revolution that would be dominated by more radical-minded people, and therefore we call it the radical phase. The radical phase also brings about the Republic. They will officially abolish the monarchy. By January of 1793, they will have executed the king. By October of 1793, they will have executed the queen, and their son, the crown prince, will die in prison. The September massacres, like I say, mark the beginning of this radical phase. And remember what I said before, he who controls the mobs will control the revolution. So these sans-culottes are going to become increasingly important for those folks that want to keep the republic alive in the National Assembly. If they can control them, they can ultimately have control of the government of all of France. The sans-culottes, with the mobs running things or seeming to run things, concerned other parts of Europe. Now they get the attention of even the British. Now remember, the British had a constitutional monarchy, a fairly classically liberal, Enlightenment-minded government in place since the late 1600s. But they were very concerned the more they saw the mobs of Paris pushing the envelope of this revolution, becoming more and more radical. So if you look here, you see this is from a British newspaper, a British cartoonist, depicting the sans-culottes in Paris as savages, eating the heads and hearts of clergy and nobility and those that supported the royalty. Also showing them as monsters, if you will, and ultimately, if they remain in charge of France, this is going to lead to more problems for all European nations. And so this is when we see Great Britain also join in the European coalition against France, along with Prussia and Austria. And eventually there will be other European nations that join as well. This means that those who have control of the National Assembly in Paris are going to have to make sure that the only way they can keep this revolution going, this revolution alive, okay, their new Republican government, is by making sure that they defeat the rest of the foreign powers in Europe that are trying to end the revolution. They also need to decide what to do with the imprisoned king and queen and the rest of the royal family. The Jacobins were a political club that developed during this time. When they had elections for the National Assembly, over time, of course, those first couple of years of the Revolution, different political parties, as we call them, or clubs, as they called them in France, developed. And the Jacobin Club was the more left-leaning or radical-minded club in the National Assembly. And it was led by Maximilien Robespierre, that you see here on the right. Also, a man named Danton, Georges Danton, that you see on the left. Now, the Jacobin Club was the most radical of all of the political parties or political clubs that had people running for office for seats in the National Assembly. And by the time we get to 1791, 1792, with the new elections in early 1792, this club won a significant number of seats in the National Assembly. And one of the reasons why still today, when it comes to political affiliations, whether it's in France or anywhere else, we say left, meaning the more liberal-minded folks, right, meaning the more conservative-minded folks, and the middle being the more moderate-minded folks, is because of where people sat in the National Assembly during the French Revolution. The more radical-minded political clubs, people who were members of those clubs who won those seats in the National Assembly, they sat farther on the left side of the room. The more conservative-minded ones sat on the right, and of course the ones that were kind of moderate sat in the middle. So we still have left, right, and center when we talk about political affiliations to this day. Anyhow, the point I'm trying to make here is that the Jacobins had won a majority of seats in the National Assembly by early 1792, and they wanted to push their own agenda, which at this point, after Louis the 16th and his family tried to escape, obviously, to go and try to raise an army with his brother-in-law, the Austrian emperor, they no longer wanted to have a constitutional monarchy. Now they wanted to have a government without a king entirely. They wanted to create a republic. Now, within the Jacobin Club, there will eventually be a division between these two men, these two leaders. Eventually, there will be two splinter groups that are created within the Jacobin Club. The Danton kind of in charge of the Girondins, and you'll see them in your textbook, and Robespierre kind of in charge of what's another splinter group called the Mountain, again in your textbook. These two groups, the Mountain was even more radical-minded than the Girondins, but really for our purposes here, just knowing them as the Jacobins and the more liberal of the political affiliations is sufficient. They are the ones now trying to push to get rid of the king altogether. Yes, he is under arrest, but now they're talking about getting rid of the monarchy altogether. And the split happens over what should be done with that king. Some believe that he should just remain in prison, the more moderate-minded ones, but others, like Robespierre in particular, in the Jacobin Party, believe that no, they need to kill the king. Otherwise, that he will always be a symbol of a rallying cry for the coalition of forces, Prussia and Austria, to rally around as they are fighting against the French in these wars to try to end the revolution and keep it from spreading. They also want to restore him to the throne. So Robespierre would argue, as long as Louis XVI is alive, he is a danger. There's always a danger that he would be restored to the throne. So the best thing to do would be to execute him as a traitor to the people of France. And that is what will happen by January of 1793. So, as I said, the Jacobins, especially under the leadership, the more radical-minded Jacobins, the Mountain, under Robespierre, by January of 1793, demanded that Louis XVI be executed as a tyrant and a traitor to the people of France. Ultimately, a new body was created called the National Convention, and the National Convention was in charge of determining the guilt or innocence of political, I guess you would say political prisoners, which of course the royal family now was considered a political prisoner. So they will execute Louis the 16th in January of 1793 with a new device that was created based on Enlightenment ideas to show equality even in execution, as well as to try to have a painless execution, and that new instrument was the guillotine. Here you see a painting of the execution of Louis XVI. It drew a big crowd, as you can see. And after executing the man with this new device that you see there, the guillotine, they held his head up for all of the sans-culottes to see, and they cheered wildly. Now, this device, the guillotine, like I said before, was designed with Enlightenment principles in mind. Formerly, when you executed somebody by beheading, it was done with a large axe of sorts, and that a man had to wield to cut your head off. And sometimes it took more than 1 or 2 whacks to finish the job, and that was seen as cruel and unusual punishment, that it would cause pain. So the guillotine was developed by a surgeon with an angled blade, and the weight of the blade, the gravity, if you will, from the scientific revolution, would ultimately cause the blade to fall, and because the blade was angled, it would slice your head off in one swoop. And supposedly it was supposed to be painless. So not that they could ask somebody afterwards, but that was the whole idea behind the guillotine. And it didn't matter what class you were from. In the French Revolution, if you were being executed as a traitor to the revolution, no matter whether you were the king or you were the lowliest sans-culotte or peasant, you would be executed the same way. So that shows you that equality that they had enshrined in the Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen, even applied all the way to execution methods. There is Louis XVI's head right there. The kings of Europe would dare challenge us. We throw them the head of a king. This is a quote by Danton, one of those Jacobins. Now, Britain, Spain, the Netherlands, and Sardinia, also known as Piedmont Sardinia, which was really it's an Italian city kingdom, if you will, joined Austria and Prussia at this point to form what's known as the First Coalition, or the First European Coalition, to try to stop the French Revolution. The beheading of Louis XVI got the attention of all of Europe, needless to say. And all of the kings and queens throughout Europe were very concerned about this idea. If this idea spreads to other territories, it could wreak havoc and cause chaos. Even Great Britain, who had a constitutional monarchy, who had back in the 1640s executed their own king, did not like the idea of beheading this king to create a republic. They saw what was going on in France as way too radical and dangerous, and it needed to be stopped. The National Convention responded to the creation of this First European Coalition against France as a declaration of war. And so they created what's called the Committee of Public Safety to have 2 roles. First of all, it was to protect the revolution from foreign threats, meaning the coalition that has formed against France. So the Committee of Public Safety was put in charge of the war effort. But also the Committee of Public Safety was to protect the revolution from domestic threats, anybody within France who might be trying to betray the revolution. At this point, if you did not support a republic, you were seen as a traitor to the revolution. Now, there were a lot of people who liked the original idea of a constitutional monarchy that was around during that more moderate phase, those first couple of years of the revolution. But a republic and executing the king, that did not sit well with some people. Some of the nobles that had joined with the Third Estate in the National Assembly at the beginning of the revolution thought that this took things too far, and so many of them found it prudent to leave France. Others who stayed and spoke out against what was going on in the National Convention with the creation of the Committee of Public Safety, they would be seen now as traitors to the revolution. And this is when we see the beginning of the Reign of Terror, to clean out domestic terrorists or domestic anti-revolutionaries, as well as to deal with the foreign threat, continuing to raise the army needed to fight against the European coalition. This is why the French Revolution is so important to European history. By the time we get to 1792, it's no longer just a thing happening in France. It's basically Europe against France in a European-wide war. That's going to eventually be dominated by a French general named Napoleon Bonaparte, who we'll talk about later. Between 1793 and 1794, the Committee of Public Safety will be led by none other than the leader of the Jacobin faction, Robespierre himself. Robespierre and the committee exercised ultimately dictatorial powers over France as it carried out a reign of terror. The idea was that civil rights and things that had been enshrined in the Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen had to be put on a temporary hold during this emergency situation. So those that might try to end the revolution could be eliminated to protect the revolution at home, as well as to protect France in its fight against the rest of Europe. This emergency situation meant that Robespierre could have dictatorial powers, emergency powers during this time, and he used those powers to clean house of anybody who was seen internally, domestically, as against the revolution, which meant against whatever he wanted to do, as well as to continue to fund the army for their fight against the European coalition. Robespierre said, "Liberty cannot be served until criminals lose their heads." He also said, "Terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, and inflexible." Now, Robespierre and the Jacobins, who are now basically in charge of the government of France, are hoping also that they can clean out society from any anti-revolutionary activity, because Robespierre and his supporters want to create a republic of virtue. Doing so, Robespierre executed the Queen. Here is a painting of the death of Marie Antoinette by guillotine. Robespierre also executed anyone that he saw as a rival for his power. This even meant that he targeted his own political party. The members of the Jacobins that did not support Robespierre's objectives would be eliminated, including Georges Danton, whom Robespierre saw as a threat to his power because of his popularity in the countryside. Ultimately, this will lead to thousands of what Robespierre refers to as enemies of the revolution falling to the guillotine. Now, Robespierre also had a man who was a supporter of the Jacobins, who was a newspaper editor, and his name was Jean-Paul Marat. Marat is spelled M-A-R-A-T. Marat helped Robespierre galvanize the sans-culottes by printing things in the newspaper that actually helped to stir up the public opinion against the enemies of Robespierre and for Robespierre himself. Ultimately, Jean-Paul Marat will be assassinated by one of the supporters of Georges Danton and his faction of the Jacobins, seeing Robespierre as too extreme, seeing his mouthpiece, Marat, as too extreme, and killing him. This, of course, will set off a slew of killings by Robespierre and his supporters to weed out any and all enemies of the revolution. In other words, enemies of Robespierre. Anybody who is not for Robespierre is against Robespierre. And thus we have the Reign of Terror. About 300,000 were arrested between the end of 1792 and the beginning of 1794. Between 16,000 and 50,000 were executed by guillotine. As I stated before, the Committee of Public Safety was also in charge of the war effort. So they were not just cleaning out the enemies of the revolution at home. They were also fighting against the enemies of the revolution abroad with the war with the European coalition. So in 1793, the Committee of Public Safety, in the hands of Robespierre, issued what was called a levée en masse, which basically was establishing compulsory military service for all men in France from the ages of 18 to 40. This is a massive draft is what this is. And this will raise a large army that France can use to fight against its foes outside of France, the European coalition, as well as they could be used inside of France to help clean out the enemies of the Republic or of the revolution. Here's a quote. From this moment until such time as its enemies shall have been driven from the soil of the Republic, all Frenchmen are in permanent requisition for the services of the armies. The young men shall fight, the married men shall forge arms and transport provisions, the women shall make tents and cloths or clothes, and shall serve in the hospitals. The children shall turn old lint into linen, the old men shall betake themselves to the public squares in order to arouse the courage of the warriors and preach hatred of kings and the unity of the republic. This is what we call total war. With motivated troops and talented young officers who are able to rise through the ranks of the army because of their talent, because of their merit, the French were finally able to start defeating the first European coalition's professional armies. People like Napoleon Bonaparte would never have been able to rise through the ranks of the French military prior to the French Revolution, which enshrined promotion by merit. So as a byproduct of the French revolutionary ideals or of the Enlightenment ideals of promotion by merit and not basing society on privilege by birth, Napoleon and the French will be able to start defeating the First Coalition's professional armies. Napoleon will rise through the ranks very quickly to the position of general, which is interesting because not only was Napoleon not a traditional noble in French society, which is what you would have had to have been to be an officer in the army prior to the revolution, he wasn't even French. He was from Corsica, and he will be able to come to France as a young man, get an education based on Enlightenment principles, and eventually make his way through the ranks of the military because of his support for Robespierre and the Jacobins and because of his talent on the battlefield. The Committee of Public Safety successfully crushed the internal dissent within France against the revolution, as well as crush and defeat the first European coalition. But they continued the terror at home, the reign of terror at home, and ultimately people will grow weary of this over time. By the time we get to the middle of 1794, people are weary of the constant bloodshed within France. We see there start to be areas of insurrection. If you look at this map, you see the particular places in France that were rebelling against the Reign of Terror. In the Vendée region, the Vendée Rebellion, as well as other areas of insurrection. So many that they had to have a mobile guillotine go around to get rid of the enemies of the state in those regions. But this goes to show you that the paranoia of Robespierre was not something that people were going to tolerate forever. And like I said, by the middle of 1794, there will finally be a true reaction against him. Up to 450,000 of the 800,000 civilians living in the Vendée region, however, were killed before that happens. This rebellion was put down mercilessly by the Reign of Terror. Robespierre also, with his position as basically a dictator in France, began efforts to de-Christianize all of France. The de-Christianization efforts increased during the Reign of Terror. He adopted a new, what he called Republican or Revolutionary calendar, for example, that renamed all of the months of the year, created 10 months of the year, each with 30 days in them, and 3 10-day weeks in each month, naming them things that had to do with the time of year where they were taking place rather than the traditional names of months, which Robespierre saw as too based in Christianity. So he saw this as another way to de-Christianize or secularize the society of France, which, remember, organized religion was something that the Enlightenment thinkers were opposed to, but de-Christianizing completely was going to be taking things a little too far for many in France, in particular those peasants who were very devout Catholics. So this remained very unpopular. This policy was very unpopular, in particular among the rural areas of France in the countryside. The Catholic Church was linked with real or potential counter-revolution ultimately as a result. Religion was associated with the Ancien Regime and superstitious practices. So this is one of the reasons why Robespierre attacked him. However, even though the policies were unpopular in the rural areas of France, within the cities, especially in the capital city of Paris, it was very popular among the sans-culottes, who now were in great support of Robespierre. And remember what I said before, he who controls the mobs controls the revolution. Therefore, religion had no place in a rational, secular republic, Robespierre would argue. This policy, however, will turn many against him and we start to see the weakening of the Reign of Terror as a result. Here is the Republican calendar that also renamed the years. Year 1 was the year that the Republic was established in France, and then it goes from there. The new names of the Republican calendar and the meaning of each of those new names and how it broke down. The cult of the supreme being was also something that Robespierre used in the de-Christianization process of France. It alienated most of the population, like I said, especially in the rural areas, however. In July of 1794, the National Convention actually was able to reassert its authority without Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety being able to stop them. And finally, this reaction against Robespierre takes place. It's known as the Thermidorian reaction, taking a name from the month in which it takes place, the new name for the month, which was basically July, was Thermidor. And finally, Robespierre himself will be the final victim of the Reign of Terror that he created. It's kind of poetic justice that Robespierre created the monster that eventually destroys himself. Here's Robespierre. It's a political cartoon, if you will. Say it was called Robespierre executing the last man in France, the executioner. But as we know, Robespierre himself, as the executioner, will be the last man in France to fall victim to the Reign of Terror. The new government that will be established by now the National Convention will try to eliminate the risk of one man gaining too much power, like Robespierre had in the 2 years previous. So this new government will be called the Directory. The Directory will be the executive branch of the government, and they will still have the legislative branch of the government be the National Assembly that is elected on a regular basis by universal male suffrage, all men having the vote. The new government, however, consisted of a bicameral legislature, a two-house legislature, and this executive body was made up of 5 men instead of it just being one man, Robespierre. The thing that happened with Robespierre and the Jacobins is that Robespierre, as the head of the Jacobins during the emergency situation, had control over the National Assembly, the National Convention, and the executive branch. And that's why it led to a dictatorship during the Reign of Terror. So they create this 5-man executive branch body to try to avoid one man gaining too much power. And these 5 men were chosen directly from the National Assembly by the political parties that they represented. The Directory was dominated ultimately, however, by rich bourgeoisie, and they didn't really do a lot to deal with the inflationary problems that were still plaguing France and was one of the reasons why the revolution happened in the first place. Food shortages were still a problem. Corruption within the government was still a problem. But now those corrupt officials in the government were not nobles, they were bourgeoisie. By 1799, 5 years after the establishment of the Directory, we see a coup d'etat happen. A coup d'etat just means a fast overthrow of the government. And it was led by a group of conspirators against the Directory. But one of those was, of course, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte had already grown in popularity in the hearts and minds, I should say, of the French people due to his many military victories that he continued to win even after the Thermidorian reaction. He pledged his loyalty to the Directory to get himself out of hot water as having been a supporter of Robespierre during the Thermidorian reaction. He was a talented general, and they could not really afford to kill one of their best generals when they were still fighting a war against the European coalition. So Napoleon Bonaparte will continue to win battles. He sent on numerous campaigns in Italy, in Egypt. Even though he doesn't always win everything, he's able to spin in the press his military exploits. And the people of France loved him. He was like the, poster boy for the French Revolution and inspires French nationalism. And he's so popular in the hearts and minds of the people that he's able to eventually convert that popularity to political power. He and his conspirators overthrow the Directory in a coup d'etat and seize power. This is what some argue is the third phase of the French Revolution, which is where we have Napoleon on the rise. He will first be a consul, and he will eventually name himself Emperor of France. So now let's talk about the rise and eventually the fall of Napoleon. Napoleon took command, and his popularity soared, as I mentioned before, as he restored order after the Thermidorian reaction. He also stimulated prosperity after he took over after the coup d'etat against the Directory. He was able to fix the economic problems and even continue to win battles against the now second European coalition that had formed against France. So Napoleon is an interesting figure, and as historians contemplate him, they often refer to him as being a paradox, meaning sometimes a contradiction. What he did is he simultaneously upheld some of the ideals of the French Revolution, for example, promotion by merit and equality before the law, but he also simultaneously destroyed some of the ideals of the French Revolution. He manipulated things to work in his favor. He censored the press. He eventually declares himself Emperor of France. And remember, the French Revolution was designed initially to create a constitutional government. He's an interesting figure when we consider how he is a paradox, both simultaneously upholding some of the ideals of the French Revolution while also destroying some of them at the same time. We'll consider this as we go through the remainder of these slides. Napoleon used his power to make France an efficient modern nation, embodying, many would argue, the Enlightenment philosophers' concept of an enlightened despot or an enlightened absolute ruler. So in one way, because of that, he seems to fulfill some of the ideals of the Enlightenment. However, many other philosophers did not like the concept of absolute rule at all. So he refutes some of those ideals in that respect as well. Here's a quote from Napoleon. He says, "Such work as mine is not done twice in a century. I have saved the revolution as it lay dying. I have cleansed it of its crimes and have held it up to the people, shining with fame. I have inspired France and Europe with new ideas that will never be forgotten." So now let's talk about some of the things that Napoleon did. And like I said, some of the things that he did seem to, support the ideals of the French Revolution and the Enlightenment. Others seem to destroy those ideals. So the paradox that is Napoleon will be discussed as we go through these things. This first one here, though, is the legal code that he created, known as the Napoleonic Code. Napoleon's legal experts that he brought together ultimately consolidated hundreds of laws into a uniform legal code for France, which remains the basis of French law still to this day in the Napoleonic Code. The Napoleonic Code will also influence other nations as they create new governing structures based on constitutionalism, believe it or not. The Napoleonic Code will become sort of the basis of those legal systems that are created later as well. And the Napoleonic Code is still the basis of state law in places like Louisiana in our nation, since Louisiana at one time belonged to France. The code, the Napoleonic Code, guaranteed the achievements of the French Revolution, like equality under the law, meaning a society is not based upon privilege by birth. It also enshrined freedom of religion, the abolition of privilege, and also protected property rights. So you can see how these ideals very much mimic the ideals of the Enlightenment and of the French Revolution in the first place. It is said that Napoleon stated about this, "I brought order out of chaos. I rewarded merit or talent, regardless of birth or wealth, wherever I found it. I abolished feudalism and restored equality to all, regardless of religion and before the law. I fought the decrepit monarchies of Europe." The fighting continues in what we now call the Napoleonic Wars, okay, because the alternative was the destruction of all this, all the reforms. "I purified the revolution," is what Napoleon said. The Napoleonic Code increased the authority of husbands over their families. And this would ultimately be a major blow to women's rights in France. Women had actually gained some rights with the early phase of the French Revolution, especially after the Women's Bread March in 1789, late 1789. But this will be a major blow to women's rights. Women were not able to seek a divorce themselves unless they could prove some kind of, abuse from their husbands, but the husbands could divorce them easily. Women lost a lot of their rights over property that they had from the earlier phases of the French Revolution as well. Women are nothing but machines for producing children, Napoleon Bonaparte said. The Concordat of 1801 was another policy of Napoleon's that he entered into with the Roman Catholic Church. Now remember what I said Robespierre had done with trying to de-Christianize France, and it wasn't very popular because many of the lower classes in France, which made up 95% of the population, were very devout in their religion. So, in their Catholicism in particular. So, in 1801, Napoleon signed a treaty with the Roman Catholic Church called the Concordat of 1801, which made the church, the Roman Catholic Church, the de facto religion of France once again, meaning the official religion of France will be the Roman Catholic Church. And Napoleon, however, also still maintained that the leadership in France, which was him, earned the right to still appoint French clergy. So this is not very different than what the earlier kings had done in France. They had secured the right to appoint their own clergy members without the approval of the papacy. That happened all the way back in 1516 with the Concordat of Bologna. Now it's being reasserted by Napoleon as the dictator, the leader of France. He said, skillful conquerors have not got entangled with priests. They can both contain them and use them. Religion is excellent stuff for keeping common people quiet. Religion is what keeps the poor from murdering the rich, Napoleon stated. Napoleon disliked republics, especially after what happened in the Reign of Terror. Even though he had been a supporter of Robespierre, he didn't really like the idea of the people having a huge amount of say in what was going to happen. Now, he maintained them having the right to, quote, vote, unquote, but he manipulated that vote by wording things on the ballot in such a way that he usually got the answer he wanted from the people. It was called the plebiscite. You can read about that in your textbook. He reduced the power ultimately of the National Assembly over time and censored the press, as I mentioned before, only allowing things to be printed that he approved of. And he also suppressed any and all political opposition to him. This is how he eventually, goes against some of the ideals of the French Revolution when I talked about that paradox, by becoming a dictator and naming himself emperor. So again, he enshrines some of the ideals of the French Revolution and he negates other ones. Napoleon said, "Power is my mistress. I have worked too hard at her conquest to allow anyone to take her away from me." Also, he said, "France has more need of me than I have need of France." By 1804, Napoleon made it official. Instead of just being consul and then consul for life, he declared himself emperor in 1804. He put the crown on his own head, and the nation was grateful. As I said before, Napoleon delivered on his promises. They continued to win victories against the European coalition, and by this point, France was not just winning by defending themselves, they were gaining territories to control, creating a large French empire out of the majority of Western Europe. The nation loved him for that. Their economy was stabilized. They were conquering territories. They were becoming more powerful on the world stage. So everybody loves a winner, right? So they were willing, perhaps, to give up some of the gains that they had received in terms of having a say in their government in exchange for these kinds of victories. Here is Napoleon placing the crown on his wife, Josephine, as the Empress of France. Between 1805 and 1807, after he has secured himself as the emperor at home, Napoleon continued to go to war against the Second European Coalition. And he defeated armies one by one through this 2-year period. He defeated Austria, he defeated Prussia, and he ultimately will defeat Russia in a series of brilliant military victories. By 1808, French rule extended from the North Sea to Spain and to throughout much of Italy as a result of these acquisitions of Napoleon. They will extend even further as we move into 1810 and beyond. Madame Germaine de Staël, who was a supporter of the Enlightenment, argued that he was like an expert chess player with the human race for an opponent, which he proposed to checkmate. He was that brilliant of a military tactician that it was very difficult to ever really defeat him on land. Now at sea, that's a different thing. Great Britain will give him trouble. Napoleon's navy was beaten by Britain's navy several times. Britain's Lord Horatio Nelson was the victor at the Battle of Trafalgar, which was a ginormous victory for Great Britain and Napoleon's first real big loss. Britain remained outside of Napoleon's rule as a result. They will not become part of the larger Napoleonic or French Empire as a result. Here is a painting of the loss of the French fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar to Lord Horatio Nelson. Here is Lord Nelson, and there's a map of the battle itself. Happened in October of 1805. Here's a breakdown of British and French ships. You see the British actually had fewer ships than France, but the British lost no ships and France lost 2/3 of their ships. So as Napoleon took control over most of Europe in the name of France, extending the French Empire, one of the key things that he did once he defeated most of the Austrian Empire is formally dissolve what had once been referred to as the Holy Roman Empire, all those Germanic principalities that had been in place, hundreds of them since the end of the 30 Years' War. And what he did instead was establish a German confederation of about 39 states, one of which was the Austrian Empire, another was Prussia, Grand Duchy of Warsaw, Confederation of the Rhine, etc. He also worked to abolish all the remaining remnants of feudalism and serfdom throughout the Central European territories, which will eventually be part of that German Confederation as well. So I have it referenced here as Germany, but just remember there is no United State of Germany at this point. It is rather a conglomeration of a bunch of different Germanic principalities, and they become known as the German Confederation. He organized them into about 39 separate German states, but they are all now dependent on him. He has conquered them. Napoleon appeared invincible, but his insatiable desire for power led him to make 3 disastrous mistakes. First, in 1806, Napoleon introduced the continental system to try to hurt Great Britain. Since he could not invade Great Britain, he had failed to do so with that loss at the Battle of Trafalgar. He decided to try to hurt Great Britain in its pocketbook. The continental system basically closed all European ports to British trade. Since he controlled most of Europe, Western Europe at this point, he was able to basically force those that he had taken over to follow this policy. It did not make many of these nations happy, however. And so ultimately, his idea was, if I hurt Great Britain in their pocketbook, in their wallet, they're going to eventually capitulate to some of my demands and we'll be able to negotiate. But it did not work. So that could be considered mistake number one. Here's a British cartoon about the continental system. Napoleon hoped the continental system would destroy Britain's economy, but it did not. Mistake number two came in 1808. Napoleon overthrew Spain's monarchy, which had been a member of the Bourbon family from the original French monarchy, and instead he installed his brother Joseph on the throne there. This outraged the Spanish people, and there began to be a rebellion against Napoleon's forces as a result. Napoleon came in and he crushed the rebellion, treated the Spanish very poorly, a lot of slaughter, and ultimately this turned a lot of folks against him and his tactics, and ultimately it's going to reflect badly on him and be another mistake that he makes. Here's a quote from the French ambassador in Spain who said, "If the Emperor Napoleon decides to make war," meaning on the Spanish people, "it is possible, even probable, that we shall be defeated. But the Spaniards have frequently been defeated, and they are not beaten, nor have they surrendered." In other words, it's going to continue to come back and bite us. The Spanish will not accept this rule of Bonaparte over them, and they will continually be rebelling against them. And this is going to eventually become a thorn in Napoleon's side as well. So as part of that mistake number two, Spanish fighters, Spanish rebels, called guerrillas, repeatedly ambushed the French forces. 300,000 French troops were killed in the next 5 years in trying to quell the Spanish rebels. This ultimately would end up in victory over Spain for Napoleon, but it was such a costly victory, losing so many forces. I mean, over 250,000 men, that those are men that he's going to have a hard time replacing. And so that's going to be a reason why this ends up being such a big mistake for him. Mistake number two. By 1812, we have mistake number three. This was when Napoleon ordered an invasion of Russia because Tsar Alexander I refused to adhere to the continental system that Napoleon created and refused to stop trade with Britain. Ultimately, when Napoleon ordered this invasion of Russia, this is going to be sort of the first real nail in his coffin. Invading Russia is very difficult. Russia is large. It can trade space for time. And the Russian winter is the best weapon that the Russian soldiers have against an invading force. If they can pull you deeper, your army deeper and deeper into Russia and just wait for the winter to set in, that invading force will ultimately have to retreat. They will be defeated. And that's exactly what's going to happen to Napoleon. Here is a painting of Napoleon as he enters the secondary capital of Moscow. When he reaches Moscow, the Russian forces still refusing to engage, still retreating and pulling him deeper into Russia. The Tsar refuses to back down. one of the things that the Russian soldiers had done as they were retreating is they would also use scorched earth tactics. The scorched earth tactics, yes, burned a lot of Russian lands and would be costly for Russia in the future. But at the same time, they were burning all of the land and all of the supplies. So Napoleon's forces, as they are pulled deeper into Russia, cannot resupply themselves. And ultimately, Napoleon's forces are going to have to withdraw. They're going to have to retreat out of Russia once the winter sets in, and they have to go back over the same lands that are now scorched earth territory. They will not be able to resupply themselves. They start to die of starvation and exposure to the cold. And Napoleon ultimately loses almost 500,000 men in the process of trying to invade Russia, to no avail. He will fail to get the Russian government to capitulate to him. So that is mistake number 3. Napoleon's Grand Army does seize Moscow, but as I said, Tsar Alexander I refused to surrender the entire government to him. And the winter, by this point, had started to happen, had started to settle in. And Napoleon is forced to withdraw, to order a retreat of his troops across the very lands that are already scorched and where there's nothing that they can resupply themselves off of. And now the winter set in and they are starting to, as I said before, die of exposure to cold as well as starvation. The bitterly cold weather, disease, and Russian guerrilla attacks that continued nearly destroyed the Grand Army as it retreated. As I said before, a loss of nearly about 500,000 men. So if you consider the losses in Spain, 300,000 men, and the losses in Russia, about 500,000 men, about 500,000 men, that's almost 1,000,000 men lost right there. And so it's the beginning of the end for Napoleon's domination of Europe. Here's a quote by Michael Ney, who talked about this. He said, "The army marches covered in great snowflakes. The stragglers fall to the lances of the Cossacks. As for me, I cover the retreat. Behind files the army with broken ranks. It is a mob without purpose, famished, feverish. General famine and general winter, rather than the Russian bullets, have conquered the Grand Army." So here are the numbers. Upon the invasion into Russia, Napoleon entered with over 600,000 men. Dead or captured at the end of this invasion in 1812, 570,000 men. So the troops remaining upon the retreat out of Russia are only 30,000 men out of the original over 600,000. Russian newspaper. The Russian winter defeats the Napoleonic army. October 1813, we see a newly, I guess you say, restored Grand Alliance against Napoleon. They're going to regroup and they are going to take back territories that had been lost to Napoleon before. They sense the weakness after the Russian invasion and they pounce. So this newly formed Grand Alliance will be, of course, Great Britain and Russia and Prussia and Austria. And over the period of this month, this Grand Alliance will defeat Napoleon at what is called the Battle of Nations. Napoleon will be defeated. In March of 1814, those same allied armies of the Grand Alliance now have pushed the French forces all the way back into France proper, to the borders of France, and they have pushed beyond those borders and into the capital city of Paris. Once they reach Paris, Napoleon is forced to abdicate his throne, and the Grand Alliance exiles him to the island of Elba. Now, I've had students before ask me, why did they not execute him? Why did they not kill Napoleon when they had the chance, when they entered Paris? And the best answer is this. The French people, even though Napoleon had now lost all of Europe and lost, really, France to the Grand Alliance, Napoleon was a master at gaining the approval of the French people. He always had been. They loved him. He was like the mascot for France. And so he was way too popular in the minds and hearts of the French people for the Grand Alliance to kill him. If they did, they would have a revolt within France of the regular people on their hands, especially those sans-culottes living in the city of Paris. So instead, they decided that they would force him to abdicate his throne and exile him to the island of Elba, which is just off the coast of France, between, it's like in the French Riviera area, and it's very, very close to France. It wasn't far enough, is my point, because Napoleon is not quite done, as we will see. However, here is part of the Treaty of Fontainebleau. It says, the Allied powers, having declared that Emperor Napoleon was the sole obstacle to the restoration of peace in Europe, Emperor Napoleon, faithful to his oath, declares that he renounces for himself and his heirs the thrones of France and Italy, and that there is no personal sacrifice, even that of his life, which he is not ready to do in the interest of France. But of course, he will not sacrifice his life for France. Within a year, Napoleon escapes the island of Elba and forms a new army. Because of his popularity with the French people, when he escapes the island and reaches the coastline of France, he quickly finds supporters and is able to amass an army fairly quickly, marching into Paris, catching the restored Bourbon monarch, which was the brother of Louis XVI, who had been executed in the Revolution. His brother will become Louis XVIII. Purposely, he didn't take the number 17 out of respect for his nephew, who would never be king, who died in prison. But the point being, Napoleon still had the support of the regular people in France. And so he was able to amass this army and once again, not only challenge, the new king, Louis XVIII, but also go to war one last battle against what remains of the Grand Alliance. By June of 1815, that Grand Alliance will formally defeat Napoleon one last time in Belgium at the Battle of Waterloo. This was done primarily with British forces, but also with some Prussian and Austrian backups as well. Napoleon's final defeat is at the Battle of Waterloo, June 1815. This time, Napoleon's forced to abdicate once again, and this time he was exiled once again, not killed, but exiled, but to an island far away in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, where he will die in the year 1821. Ultimately, the death of Napoleon means the death of the empire. There will be no second 100 days, if you will. France will, from this point forward, have a constitutional monarchy for the remainder of middle of the until the middle of the 1800s. And yes, they restored monarchy, but the Grand Alliance does not force France to accept an absolute monarchy, knowing that the people of France, having gone through the revolution, would accept nothing less than a constitutional monarchy. This is where St. Helena is located, so it's not close to anything. It's in the middle between Africa and South America in the Atlantic Ocean. Now let's talk a little bit about other revolutions that were inspired by Enlightenment ideals, besides just the two big ones that we've discussed thus far. Latin America will also go through a series of revolutions at this same time. The Enlightenment values, the American and French revolutions, both or all inspired revolts across Latin America. Most of the colonies will be independent by 1830 as a result. Now remember, Latin America is Central and South America that had been taken over predominantly by Spain back in the age of exploration. So these are native populations that are now rebelling against the Spanish authorities that are in charge of those areas. And of course, it's not just Spanish authorities that we need to worry about in parts of Latin America, but also the French colony of Santo Domingo, also known as Haiti, will also have a revolution. The Haitian Revolution on this Caribbean island of Hispaniola was really the first successful Latin American revolt. It actually happens while Napoleon was still in power in France. Haiti was a French colony by this point, and Napoleon had a hard time putting down this rebellion because he was fighting against the European coalition in Europe. His forces were spread way too thin. He could not really afford to keep fighting in Haiti to try to put down these rebels and continue to fight against the European coalition within Europe. So Napoleon ended up cutting his losses and giving Haiti their independence. There's a map of Haiti. A quote based on this: thousands of slaves were imported from Africa to work on the tobacco, cocoa, cotton, and indigo farms. By the mid-18th century, Santo Domingue had become the most lucrative colony in the Caribbean. Over 40% of all European sugar and 75% of all European coffee, as well as much of France's 18th century wealth and glory, came from the slave labor in the plantations of La Perle des Antilles, Santo Domingue. So this was a costly loss for Napoleon. However, he had to cut his losses because he had bigger fish to fry, he thought, in Europe. How did it go down? Well, in 1789, French plantation owners used the turmoil of the French Revolution that was going on within France proper, started in 1789, and also the Enlightenment ideas to gain home rule and economic freedom. These French plantation owners wanted to declare themselves independent from France proper, to have their, kind of like the American Revolution did, the folks living in the Americas, okay, the British colonists revolt against their monarch. Wealthy French landowners granted no rights, however, okay, to the free people of color, as they were called, gens de couleur, or the sizable slave population. So even though they may have gained independence for Haiti, there was still a lot of problems in Haiti because they did not give rights to the free people of color. So in 1791, just 2 years later, Boukman, a voodoo priest, led a rebellion of slaves and Maroons, which were escaped slaves, against the white elite of Santo Domingue or Haiti. By 1797, another leader, a former slave named Toussaint Louverture, led a revolt after Boukman died. He held the island, killed the slave owners, and destroyed the plantations. Toussaint Louverture was very much influenced by the ideals of the Enlightenment. He had been educated in the Enlightenment ideals, and he used those to galvanize the public to support him. I was born a slave, but nature gave me the soul of a free man. Toussaint Louverture. In 1801, Toussaint created a constitution that granted equality and citizenship to all residents of the colony. If you read through these, you can pause the video and you can see out of these articles, many of these ideas are incorporated in the United States Constitution with our Bill of Rights, natural rights of life, liberty, and property, which come from Locke. And it outlines specific individual rights to property and to life and to freedom of religion and freedom of speech. You may pause the video to read through each of these rather than me reading through them myself. Now, in 1802, Napoleon did attempt to restore order in this highly profitable colony. Toussaint was captured and died, but slaves that were inspired by Toussaint's leadership and by the rights that they had secured ultimately rebelled, continued to rebel, and defeated the French forces. Now, of course, Napoleon could not afford to send over his entire army, and therefore this is why, as I stated a few slides ago, he ultimately cut his losses and had to allow for Haiti to have its independence because he had bigger fish to fry back at home in Europe. In 1804, Haiti declared its independence completely from France again, though instability, economic weakness, and corruption still remain problems to this day. Independence movements spread from Haiti to the rest of Latin America. The Creoles, which were the ones that were of European descent, but that were born in Latin America, now outnumber the Peninsulares, who were the ones who were Europeans but were born in Europe and transplanted to the New World, to Latin America. And so those Creoles now are seeking Enlightenment reforms and independence themselves from the mother countries. Revolutions led to independence in many of these areas, but only really benefited the white Creole elites and the Catholic Church, not other members of the casta system throughout the Latin American territories. In 1813, Simón Bolívar, a Venezuelan Creole, joined a junta, or a military organization, and seized the city of Caracas and broke away from Spain. Venezuela will become an independent state from Spanish authority. Spanish forces will retake the city, and Bolívar was sent into exile in Jamaica for 1 year, but this will not be the end of the story. Bolívar's letter from Jamaica outlines his desire for a republican government in that area and the unification of all of Latin America. It's not enough for Venezuela to just be free, but all of Latin America must be free from Spanish control if any of them will be free. And this will be a very inspirational letter to other nationalists, to other folks wanting independence from Spanish control throughout Latin America. My dear sir, success will crown our efforts because the destiny of America, meaning South America or Latin America here, has been irrevocably decided. The tie that bound her to Spain has been severed. The hatred that the peninsula has inspired in us is greater than the ocean between us. We are threatened with the fear of death, dishonor, and every harm. There is nothing we have not suffered at the hands of that unnatural stepmother, Spain. The veil has been torn asunder. We have already seen the light, and it is not our desire to be thrust back into darkness. The role of the inhabitants of the American hemisphere has for centuries been purely passive. Politically, they were non-existent. We are still in a position lower than slavery, and therefore it is more difficult for us to rise to the enjoyment of freedom. We have been harassed by a conduct which has not only deprived us of our rights, but has kept us in a sort of permanent infancy with regard to public affairs. If we could at least have managed our domestic affairs and our internal administration, we could have acquainted ourselves with the processes and mechanics of public affairs. We are surrounded with galling restrictions, such as being forbidden to grow European crops, or to store products which are royal monopolies, or to establish factories of a type the peninsula itself does not possess. Do you wish to know what our future held for Americans, meaning Latin Americans? Simply the cultivation of the fields of indigo, grain, coffee, sugarcane, cacao, and cotton, cattle raising on the broad plains, hunting wild game in the jungles, digging in the earth to mine its gold. So negative was our existence that I can find nothing comparable in any other civilized society. It is not an outrage and a violation, is it not an outrage and a violation of human rights to expect a land so splendidly endowed, so vast, rich, and populous, to remain merely passive, meaning to the mother country? It is harder, Montesquieu has written, to release a nation from servitude than to enslave a free nation. This truth is proven by the animals of all times, which reveal that most free nations have been put under the yoke, but very few enslaved nations have recovered their liberty. Despite the convictions of history, South Americans have made efforts to obtain liberal, even perfect institutions, doubtless out of that instinct to aspire to the greatest possible happiness, which common to all men is bound to follow in civil societies, founded on the principles of justice, liberty, and equality. You can see the Enlightenment influence there. More than anyone, I desire to see America fashioned into the greatest nation in the world. Greatest not by so much by virtue of her area and wealth, but as by her freedom and glory. Now remember, he means Latin America, okay, South America. Although I seek perfection from the government for the government of my country, I cannot persuade myself that the new world can, at the moment, be organized as a great republic. Since it is impossible, I dare not desire it. Yet much less do I desire to have all South America a monarchy, because this plan is not only impractical but also impossible. Wrongs now existing could not be righted, and our emancipation would be fruitless. The South American states need the care of paternal governments to heal the sores and wounds of despotism and war. As soon as we are strong and under the guidance of a liberal nation which will lend us her protection, we will achieve accord in cultivating the virtues and talents that lead to glory. Then will we march majestically toward that great prosperity for which South America is destined. Simón Bolívar. Bolivar's letter inspired by Enlightenment thinkers and argued independence movements would safeguard natural rights. In 1821, Bolivar had liberated Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, and Ecuador from Spanish rule, and he formed what was called the Republic of Gran Colombia. In 1824, Peru and the Republic of Bolivia joined Gran Colombia, but regional uprisings threatened Bolivar's vision of unification. In 1830, Bolivar resigned as president of Gran Colombia, and it broke apart. Colombians, today I cease to govern you. I have served you for 20 years as soldier and leader. During this long period, we have taken back our country and liberated 3 republics. These services were inspired by your virtues, your courage, and your patriotism. Mine is the great privilege of having governed you. Fearing that I may be regarded as an obstacle to establishing the republic on the true base of its happiness, I personally have cast myself down from the supreme position of leadership to which your generosity had elevated me. Do not be deceived, Colombians. My only desire has been to contribute to your freedom and to be the preservation of your peace of mind. If for this I am held guilty, I deserve your censure more than any man. Do not listen, I beg you, to the vile slander and the tawdry envy stirring up discord on all sides. Colombians, gather round. The Constitutional Congress. It represents the wisdom of the nation and the legitimate hope of the people. Its sovereign decrees will determine our lives, the happiness of the Republic, and the glory of Colombia. If dire circumstances should cause you to abandon it, there will be no health for the country, and you will drown in the ocean of anarchy, leaving as your children's legacy nothing but crime, blood, and death. Fellow countrymen, hear my final plea as I end my political career. In the name of Colombia, I ask you, beg you, to remain united, lest you become the assassins of the country and your own executioners. Simón Bolívar. Unfortunately, they did not heed his warning, and when he resigned as president, they did not remain united. They broke apart. In 1812, a junta led by José de San Martín led a rebellion against Spanish control in Argentina. Martín helped gain independence for Argentina from Spain, and Chile also gained independence with the help of Martín. But, like Bolivar, he failed to prevent political fragmentation in those regions. San Martín arrived in Guayal for a conference in 1822, where he was enthusiastically greeted by Bolivar. However, the two men could not come to an agreement despite their common goals and mutual respect, even when San Martín offered to serve under Bolivar. Both men had very different ideas about how to organize the governments of the countries that they had liberated. Bolivar was in favor of forming a series of republics in the newly independent nations, whereas San Martín preferred to put monarchies in place. The conference, consequently, was a failure. Creole leaders like Juan Mandela Rosas, who reigned in Argentina from 1835 to 1852, will eventually centralize the rule in Argentina, but people like him brutally oppressed the native population. 1810, Father Miguel de Hidalgo led a rebellion against the Spanish in Mexico. The largest and richest Spanish colony in the Americas was freed from Spanish control. Father Hidalgo in 1811 was executed, however. The Creoles feared his appeal among the Amerindians and worried that they would lose their position in society. My children, a new dispensation comes to us today. Will you receive it? Will you free yourselves? Will you recover the land stolen 300 years ago from your forefathers by the hated Spaniards? We must act at once. Will you defend your religion and your rights as true patriots? Long live Our Lady of Guadalupe. Death to bad government. Death to gauchpins, or slang for peninsulares. Father Hidalgo's cry of dolorous speech. In 1815, Father Jose Maria Morales urged the seizure of Creole mines and ranches, and was executed for continuing the popular rebellion within Mexico. May slavery be banished forever, together with the distinction between castes, all remaining equal, so Americans, or meaning South Americans, may only be distinguished by vice or virtue. In 1821, the Creole military leader Augustin de Iturbide united with rebellious peasants to declare Mexican independence officially from Spain. Iturbide declared himself Emperor of Mexico, rejecting liberal Enlightenment ideas, but Creoles later overthrew him and established a republic. The unity of Mexico will also fizzle. In 1838, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica all broke free from Mexico. In the Constitution of 1857, Benito Juarez tried to limit the influence of the Roman Catholic Church and the military in Mexico to protect natives' freedoms. He said the abolition of slavery should happen, banned in 1829, free tuition, no limit in favor of religion, freedom of vocation, meaning job, freedom of speech, right to bear arms, titles of nobility are not recognized, prohibition of punishment by mutilation, beatings, branding, flogging, beating with sticks, torture of any kind, excessive fines, or the confiscation of goods. The sovereignty of the nation comes from the people, division of powers, executive, legislative, and judicial, and the inviolability of the Constitution. You can see all kinds of Enlightenment ideals that influenced that Constitution of 1857. But despite Juarez's efforts, Creoles confiscated the church lands, and 95% of Mexican peasants remained landless. In 1807, Napoleon's forces invaded Portugal, and the royal family fled to their colony, Brazil. In 1821, King Dom João VI returned to Portugal and left his son Pedro I behind to rule Brazil as his regent. In 1822, the revolutionaries in Brazil proclaimed Pedro the Emperor of Brazil. Brazil remained the only monarchy left in Latin America.